Well, we're still missing a panelist, but Heather Grubby is probably appearing shortly. So while we're waiting, let me introduce this panel. There's Heather. Hello. So we had a great introduction, but a little bit pretty gloomy introduction to the day. We will attempt to brighten this up. It will be difficult, but we will try. We will look at what the EU is possibly doing as a guardian, should be doing, and can actually be doing as a guardian of democracy in Europe. We have a great panel. I don't want to introduce everyone separately because you have it in the booklet, and it probably takes up too much time, and then we're halfway through, and that's probably more positive than the last panel already introducing the panelists, but we will move right to the issue. But we have a panel from people from Hungary, from Germany, from the UK. We have academics, civil society activists, politicians. We have a political background. We have a institutional. We have a legal background. So everyone is here. Also, sort of nearly, if you take me out because I'm only the moderator, we have a great gender balance. So everything is here. Yeah, I'm neutral. But also we will experiment with technology. I think it's done here at the CEU all the time, but obviously I haven't done it very much. We will experiment with analog technologies, so nothing is in the cloud. It all stays here in this bunker, and we all have these little devices, and then you can press, and then we get the answer straight behind us. So you see that thing. And let's start before we start discussing. Let's start with two issues, two questions, and test out this technology. First question coming up: will you be participating in the upcoming EP parliamentary elections?
I don't want to see any no's.
Yes, no, maybe, or no, don't know. So you press. Oh, now. And there's a question coming up shortly afterwards. Oh. No. Okay. 15% no.
It's raised back immediately.
We'll find you.
17%. Here's a former member of the European Parliament, so you have to talk to her. The 15%, we set up a table outside afterwards. And then the next question. Do you currently consider the European Union a guardian of democracy in Europe? That will be interesting. Oh, rather no. 33, don't know, 10. So that's 43, so it's quite close. But still, we are more on the positive side. We're more on the positive side. With this, I would turn to Franziska. Franziska was until recently a member of the European Parliament, sitting in Brussels, now a member of the German Bundestag, sitting in Berlin. What would you say? Is the EU a guardian, or if it's not, when did the EU lose it, or was it never a guardian?
Yeah, difficult. I think in general, of course, in a way, it's a guardian for democracy because you have to be a democracy in becoming a member of the European Union, and the EU has worked out this quite precisely in the chapters and in the Copenhagen criteria and the entire process that you have to go through. And you have the treaty with our fundamental values, and then you have the Charter for Fundamental Rights, which has some very fundamental human rights and democratic principles. And there you have an agency sitting in Vienna with the task of monitoring the human rights, fundamental values across Europe. we have some mechanisms to punish those member states that really go off the track of democracy. But on the other side, I believe that we have still much more precise mechanisms and sanction mechanisms to check budget discipline in member states than to check democracy. So in that sense, I think de facto, in an everyday life, it's not so much a guardian, even though in theory and certainly in general, when you know, for membership, it is an important criteria. But yeah, when I, as a member of the European Parliament, I was always amazed by the degree of detail how we check on budgets, and the degree of non-preciseness on democracy and human rights.
So you would say, what I would say when I started to learn Russian, there was a great term, "принципе." So in principle, the EU is a guardian, or maybe as Oasis would say, definitely maybe.
Radically unprecise, yeah.
So now we turn to a lawyer, and then of course the answer will be much more precise. So Andras, how would you explain the EU as a guardian, if at all a guardian in theory, but maybe also in practice? And maybe that's how a lawyer can explain it. In theory, yes. In practice, no. And
I mean, directly, the EU is not a guardian of member state democracies. In theory, we have a possibility, Article 7, the EU Treaty, but everybody knows it's not operative in practice. So there is a theoretical possibility, but in practice, it cannot be used. And there are proposals what should be changed, like suspension of financial supports by the European Union, but you would actually need to change primary law, and definitely secondary legislation would probably also primary law in order to achieve that, and it's very unlikely that it would happen. So I would say, those are not in theory. You have a guardianship on the side of the EU. In practice, it's not operative. I think there are ways how to achieve that, practical ways. And I think those practical ways are not, they should not be concentrated on the role of the Commission or on the role of the European Parliament, because these bodies consist of politicians. And when you have a debate about, a concept and you want to attach legal consequence to it, then you need proper legal doctrine in order to apply it, and you do not have that type of measurable proper legal doctrine for democracy. It just does not exist. What does exist is proper legal doctrine for the protection of fundamental rights, and that's why I think that the best possibility for protecting democracy within the EU, within the member states, is actually an indirect way. It's strengthening the protection of fundamental rights through the European Court of Justice.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we come to the specifics later on, but I want to sort of finish the panel on the guardianship. Heather, you are the Open Society advocate in Brussels. Do you consider the EU a guardian still, or has it ever been or not?
It has never been, and it never will be, because the member states don't want it to be. The Commission has the specific role of being the guardian of the treaties of the EU, and of course the treaties contain an important provision. I can read you Article 2, which is the EU's values that were set out. The Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities, motherhood, and apple pie. Okay, so I invented the last two, but it's very general, and it's not defined. And so I think the big issue about democracy in the Union is the old Polish saying, if I might quote a bit of Polish here, which is the question of Poland: Polska tak, ale jakie? So yes, of course Poland, but which one? And it's the same question. Yeah, of course we all believe in democracy, but which democracy do we believe in? And the treaties do not spell that out. The institutions don't spell that out. The EU has never had a democracy acquis, for the very good reason that there is a huge variety of democratic cultures, political cultures, practices of democracy, institutions across the Union. I think the issue is not about democracy. The EU cannot play a role in democracy in the member states, because these are matters that the individual countries have to decide for themselves. Where it can play a very fundamental role is in two further goals which democracy is supposed to lead to. Democracy is not an end in itself, after all. Democracy is supposed to deliver benefits. It's a system that delivers benefits. One of those benefits where the EU can help is good governance, and the other one is fundamental rights, respect for and protection of fundamental rights. And there the EU can play a role. Democracy also delivers plenty of other benefits that we can debate, but I think the EU can help on those two things. Now, governance is about the formal and informal institutions that determine who gets what in a given country. In Hungary, it's pretty clear who's in charge of governance. Now, what the EU can do is to say whether that system is fair and whether the institutions are adequate, because they also relate to the way in which the country's governance affects how it observes EU law and how it runs things like its observance of the single market. And the second thing is the fundamental rights side, where it's not very strong. This is a fairly weak area of EU law. I mean, it's still quite soft law, but the EU is an important reference point because the Charter of Fundamental Rights brings together many of the international human rights standards and also the practices within the member states. And most importantly of all, the EU has a system of law, a community of law, including a court, which can adjudicate on those rights. And of course, we all know that there is the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, a separate institution, part of the Council of Europe. But the EU's own court, the Court of Justice of the European Union in Luxembourg, is now making a lot more reference to fundamental rights. It's becoming a much more activist court. And it can, of course, issue sanctions. It can issue fines on member states, which the Strasbourg court cannot. So if the EU can get more involved in the fundamental rights field, that would be a good thing. The question is whether the member states actually will try to prevent that from happening. And I'd be happy to discuss that in a bit more detail later on.
Great. So, Jan Werner, how do you see it? Professor from Princeton, looking at Europe from the outside, because of course being a European. So, as an academic, is the EU a guardian, or do you? So far, we had more of a no, maybe. Maybe you are the one from the 57%.
Let me make 2 points, one of which will come down to radically disagreeing with Heather about what she just said. This conference features the word strategy very prominently in various places. I think to have a strategy, you need to understand what the challenge or the problem is you're dealing with, and you need to know where you eventually want to end up. What does it mean to, in a sense, successfully carry through a strategy? Maybe we can talk about the second issue later on. But first of all, I think it's very important to diagnose the challenge correctly. Personally, I think we go off on a wrong track if we assume that the challenges we're dealing with today in Europe all come down to fundamental rights violations. It's a very important issue, but I think in courts as they exist can deal with these rights violations. I think we're also going off on a wrong track if we assume that it's all about corruption. Very important problem too. But let's not throw everything together. What we're really dealing with as a challenge today in Europe is what you might call constitutional capture. And this can be a formal process, as happened in this country, or it can be a more informal attempt, probably best example, Romania in the summer of 2012. I think we are dealing with people trying to create, capture a whole political system in a deeply partisan fashion. And that will not obviously always immediately translate into fundamental rights violations. Yes, it can. The right to vote can be violated in certain ways, for instance. But we need to be clear about the problem we're dealing with. So, that brings us to the second point. Is Europe ever in a position to judge whether a country is a democracy or not? What we hear a lot from people is that, oh no, Europe is so diverse, we all have different ideas about what democracy really is. How can you compare the UK, which doesn't even have a constitutional court, to Bulgaria, everything's different. Plus, we love diversity in Europe, it's a value in itself, etc., etc. Okay, every single time we allow a country to join the European Union, somebody somewhere makes a call as to whether this country is now a liberal democracy or not. You can say, and I would say, that these processes as they exist, Copenhagen criteria and so on, are deeply flawed. The checklist, approach that says, do all the courtrooms have computers? Check. Do all the lawyers have, 3 years of training? Check. And then in the end, there's a huge box that says rule of law, and then you say check as well. Deeply flawed, granted. But it's not true that we don't make a call about a political system as a whole. We do. And we do it every single time that a country joins the EU. So I think these should be our starting points. A, the problem is constitutional capture. B, of course the EU is in a position to judge whether a country is a democracy or not. The challenge is to formalize this process, to improve this process, to, if I may add one more word, to empower a particular agency that can make these calls in a more systematic, predictable, and accountable way. So that would be my starting point for this discussion.
Okay, we come back to the agency and who can do that. But I'm glad you came in because otherwise these 57% would have looked a bit strange. But you wanted to come in?
Just very briefly, because I agree with what Jan Werner Müller just said, because I think there is a difference between systematic abuse and individual, rights that are abused. And in many of the countries we see, until you get individual rights abused, you have a long time to go. And until this case could ever go up to the European Court of Justice, if so possible, we would be already quite far away from where we should be. And everybody, it's always the question, if you ask someone, if you see it, it's an abuse. If you have to describe, it's more difficult, but everybody sort of agrees, and when you see it in reality, then you agree, yes, that's sort of not democratic, or that, it's more easy than some pretend to define it. And I believe that it's not just an Eastern European question. We were saying that there was also systematic abuse, for example, of the freedom of media in Italy, just because of the monopolization of, in a few hands of very few rich people, and that de facto you almost had no more independent media. So for that was for us also a systematic abuse, even though there was no real individual right that, somebody could have gone to court and said, I can't open my mouth, I can't speak. It was, complete freedom. But of course, you had Berlusconi media checking everything. So it's not just an Eastern European, but it's systematic. You have a problem there, and that's where I think the EU really has to play a bigger role.
Okay, let me pick you up on the question of making a call. Before you can make a call, there must be some way of monitoring, of deciding who is where, and that's exactly the second question which we have already anticipated, or the third question on the monitoring side. So who should monitor the state of democracy in the EU? Four options, and it's member states. Yeah. So Helmut, we have civil society in. Are you voting?
No, I am.
Oh.
Interesting.
Interesting. Well.
Somebody says other. Who's other?
So it's it's nearly sort of equal. We have 4 people on the panel, so maybe each of us can take up one. No, I would start with Heather, because I know from your work in with the Open Society Institute, but also before working for the European Commission, Enlargement Commissioner, you've been on both sides of the monitoring side. So what would you take out of this? Who should monitor?
Well, I was working with the somebodies somewhere who made some of these calls. And the way it happens is quite interesting, because during the accession process, maybe I'll get up and be a bit interactive with this poll. During the accession process, this is the one that makes the recommendation with a lot of input from this, and especially this. I think during the accession process, civil society is actually very powerful because it's the main reference point that the Commission draws on the state of democracy in its annual progress reports. But the other is ultimately the one that decides. Okay, so recommendation, and then this one makes the big recommendation to this, which is the member states. It's the European Council, it's the peers of the country who decide. So it's the other prime ministers and presidents who decide whether or not they think they can live with the guy who's standing in front of them saying, let me be a member of the club too. But I think the problem is that the other can also include quite a lot of other things. For example, the press often decides on these matters too. So it depends whether there have been press reports about problems with democracy. But I think Jan Werner has very rightly pointed out the fundamental problem in the whole question of the EU's role in democracy, which is the lack of an acquis, the lack of a legal framework, the lack of detailed provisions or even a detailed definition beyond what I just read out in terms of Article 2 or the Copenhagen criteria, which are very similar. It's the stability of institutions, guaranteeing democracy, rule of law, respect for and protection of minority rights and human rights. That's basically it. It's very short, and it hasn't. I agree very much that what the EU needs to do is to develop a much more reliable, accountable, systemic framework to do this. And I've argued this in writing a number of times over the past 15 years, that the EU needs an acquis démocratique. The problem is that there's no political appetite to create one. And so as a result, the EU is in this strange limbo position between the nuclear option and not even rubber bullets, the kind of pop guns that children use. It's got material sanctions which are really very low level, or it has the nuclear option. And it doesn't really have anything in between when there are problems. So it has a problem with definition of what is democracy that allows governments to claim, well, this isn't really such a big problem after all, and this is something that Hungary's got away with many times with constitutional provisions. And then even when there is an agreement that something is unacceptable, it doesn't have enough of a range of options about what to do about it. Now, I want to just tell you briefly about two of those options and why I think they could be changed. One is on the material sanctions. The material sanctions are based on an extremely narrow legal basis. It's basically about the single market and non-discrimination. So, for example, when Hungary's constitutional amendments were criticized by the EU, who were the three commissioners who were actually able to criticize them and threaten to take Hungary to court? Okay, it was not about the impact of those provisions on democracy in Hungary, not at all. It was Olli Rehn who said, well, you can't compromise the independence of the central bank because that's going to be damaging for adoption of the euro. Okay, so there's a completely different, small, narrow legal basis somewhere else, not really to do with democracy. And it was Neelie Kroes, the Digital Agenda Commissioner, who said you can't do this because what you're doing on the media, because you're discriminating between foreign media providers and domestic media providers. So it's a competition issue. Again, narrow, tiny legal issue, far away. There aren't sanctions on the democracy side that the EU can use. So that's a problem. But then if you want to escalate up to the nuclear option, which is Article 7, which is to threaten to sanctions the suspension of certain rights of a member state, including voting rights, you need to meet a very, very high threshold. First of all, as Francisco was pointing out, it needs to be serious and systematic, serious and persistent violation of the principles of the Union, which is a really high thing to reach, and it doesn't address systemic failings at a lower level that then lead you to that, so you don't have an interim provision. And also, you have to get that agreed unanimously by the other member states, who are all sitting in their chairs thinking, well, if they're going after him today, maybe they'll go after me next week. I don't think I really like this. So they're very, very reluctant to use it. It requires a very high threshold in the parliament where the party grouping that the country in question might belong to really doesn't like one of their members being criticised and can very effectively use lobbying. Again, we've seen this again in the case of Hungary. Very effective it was too. And it requires a commission report, and the commissioners too can be very reluctant to move into an area where they don't really have a legal basis. So it's just too high a threshold really to use it. Now, Viviane Reding, the Justice Commissioner, has just proposed last month, a new provision which is supposed to be an interim step of exactly the kind that several of us have been arguing for. But the problem is it's still too high a threshold. It's still not adequate. I think you probably don't want to go into all the details of this, but again, there's a fundamental problem that member states are worried about democracy among some of their members, but they're not worried enough to do anything that might rebound on them as well.
We're still on the question of monitoring because we want to come to what the EU could actually do before we move to all of you to help us work something out of this panel so that we can all go back and not say we have the answer. But coming back to you, what you said about initially about the Copenhagen criteria. It's true we don't have a acquis démocratique, but what we have is we have the Copenhagen criteria only for accession, but is there more in it? I mean, can the Copenhagen criteria be used not only when you enter, but afterwards? That because you brought it up, maybe you can say something about it.
Allow me to perhaps say two things. One is that it's true that it would probably be disastrous if we had a repetition of the experience leading up to the ill-fated constitutional treaty, when Europeans are forced to get together and really examine whether when they say Rechtsstaat, État de droit, etc., whether they really mean the same thing. They probably don't. And so we probably would be opening a Pandora's box if we had an idea that, oh, first we have to have a nice academic exercise of agreeing on all these definitions. Very unlikely to happen. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we cannot agree on certain parameters. If you look, let's say, at the opinions of the Venice Commission, it's not all over the place. It's not arbitrary. People do agree on certain core understandings. So when the Venice Commission, for instance, criticized certain aspects of the recent Hungarian constitution-making process, I think you could, in a sense, distill some criteria from that. That wouldn't force you to say, oh, but first we have to really, define everything and be exactly on the same page. Second remark, very briefly, about this. Well, it's disappeared now, but I think maybe it's important to say that these are not mutually exclusive options. And in particular, I think it's worth saying that some critics occasionally now say, well, so if the EU becomes the guardian of democracy, it's essentially more constitutional paternalism, the kind of thing that Renata was criticizing this morning, that, we impose essentially various forms of the acquis and of standards and norms, and they're never really debated, they're never truly appropriated by civil society. All this is true. But in a sense, having more guardianship, if you like, doesn't exclude the possibility of more civil society involvement. It gives it a certain backup. Nothing prevents all of us here from walking outside that door and starting whatever, European Citizens Initiative. Go out, collect 1 million signatures. You could do this anytime. Having the Commission or the Parliament or the Copenhagen Commission also be involved in this process doesn't foreclose these options. So I think we shouldn't have this fake debate that it's either popular constitutionalism or it's constitutionalism by more established institutions. It can be both, and there's no dilemma here in that sense.
Okay, so I would be very happy if we walk out of this door and create something. But maybe Franziska, I know that you've been thinking a lot about the Copenhagen criteria in your time, but also now in Brussels. What's your take?
Yeah, I agree. I also wanted to mention the Venice Commission. I'm not sure if everybody of you is familiar with it. It's a body, Venice has the name, of highly distinguished scholars who we often send actually abroad to export democratic principles, and the EU is financing it, and then we always know what we mean when we talk about democratic principles. So sometimes, we don't know it internally. We export it all the time. When we are in the accession process, we always know it, and once we are inside, nobody knows again what the democratic principles are. So in that sense, I would agree with you that we don't necessarily need a sort of a constitutional process defining them, but sort of adopting what we already do anyways. Then on the role, I just wanted to say, of civil society and European Parliament, I think the European Parliament is a good place to air concerns, but de facto not to do a real monitoring, because it's always blocked by one or the other political family. And that's, I've seen it so many times. Everybody in private could agree with you that yes, we have problems in Romania, Bulgaria, or Hungary, or Italy, or France, but then the party politics go beyond it, and you just vote with your party and your party family. In that sense, I would be less sure that the European Parliament can be the final monitor, but it can play in airing concerns and having a debate on questions like media freedom, etc. And for us, of course, it was always very important to get information from civil society actors. Like that is certainly key for getting information, for making a point, is to get the information from the ground from actors. So I would see there certainly no either or, but you know, a close cooperation. But would still warn against making the European Parliament the final arbiter, because I don't think, you know, it was sad to see also on Berlusconi. That was such a sad vote, you know. I'm like, really, everybody could agree on the danger of media freedom in Italy, but yeah, just didn't get it through.
But at least we see that there's an end to it. But Andras, you brought the idea of the courts, the legal approach in it, but there must be still some way of monitoring. How would you see it?
I mean, first of all, just a remark on Jan Werder Müller's contribution. I entirely agree with him that the problem is not just about corruption, and the problem is not just about the protection of fundamental rights. But I disagree with him on the point whether it is possible to build up a new institution like he is proposing it. Probably many of those present in the room know about his proposal on the Copenhagen Commission. I have doubts whether it's possible, because basically for such an institution you would need the agreement of all the member states, and I just cannot see this happen. So it is not. It's not realistic, I think, the introduction of this institution. Actually, if you want, as you also mentioned, if you want to have a body which monitors, you know, the quality of democracy in general in EU member states, then you already have the Venice Commission, which is not just about the EU member states. So you do actually have a body which is doing it, but it's quite a different thing, you know, to give recommendations. And it's quite a different thing to build up institutions and to have legal consequences attached to it. If you want to have such a procedure, at the end of the day, it has to end up at the court. You know, this decision has to be able to be reviewed by a court, and it has to be the European Court of Justice. And I think the question is not going to the right direction. I mean, you know, in Bavaria, you don't have democracy because in Berlin there is a body of the German federal government which monitors the quality of democracy in Bavaria, or in other federal countries. Basically, what you need is an institutional framework. You cannot just implement democracy on the spot. You need an institutional framework, and for that institutional framework, that's really just a framework. You cannot make actual democracy on the spot. Institutional framework, that would be the protection of fundamental rights, and probably also a more efficient fight against corruption on a European Union level. This European public prosecutor, which is still pending. Who knows what's going to happen? I think that's actually much more important than having a new body, which is, as I said, unlikely to be able to be set up. Having a new body which monitors democracy on the spot.
Okay, now we are coming to the key point. This was all sort of foreplay. Now we're coming to the point. How can the EU actually uphold democracy? What are the instruments? We talked about courts. We talked about other things. So we have another question for you. So it's a bit more complicated. So you get another few seconds. Woohoo. Good. Interesting. Both at least is better than none. Okay, with this, that's the key session, and then I would like to involve you in it, because maybe we have 4 great ideas, but maybe there are others out there. Jan Werner, you wrote a very interesting blog post on Verfassungsblog. I mean, I'm not a regular reader, but I liked it very much. Where you made the point that in theory there's a lot there, but in practice it's not used. So maybe you can say how the EU can uphold.
Just very briefly to Andras, if turnover of power is a criterion, I'm not sure we have democracy in Bavaria. And that's actually not a joke, because at some point...
That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, but it's in a sense, it's a serious point, because you could imagine whole European countries at some point say, look, it's true, we never have a turnover of power, but you have then examples within what everybody considers to be certainly consolidated democracy. So, again, it's a real challenge to say where the problem is. Anyway, just an aside. So, what's an effective mechanism? Maybe just a word on Article 7, which has already come up. So yes, there are concerns here about it being the nuclear option. The thresholds are very high. I agree with all of that. But maybe it's also worth putting on the table a thought about what it actually is in its essence and what it does. Because people think of Article 7 as a sanction. Yes, in certain ways it is. But it's actually not really a form of intervention in the country itself. It's a kind of, if you like, normative quarantine. It basically isolates a country. It says, we have such doubts about your democratic processes that we, the rest of us Europeans, don't want to be subject to rules and regulations that your government has had a hand in. That's very different from saying we want to do something directly in the country or against a particular government. It basically says we don't want to play with you anymore. And as we know from, kids and sandboxes and so on, that can be very effective in certain ways. But it's really just a kind of let's leave you alone. And in theory, it can go on forever. There's nothing in it, in the mechanism itself, that forces that particular country to change anything, do anything, and so on. So I think that has led some of us, quite apart from concerns about the high thresholds, to think that maybe one needs actual intervention along the lines of, let's say, financial penalties. Clearly there's also a discussion to be had here about who's going to be hit by these penalties. It's usually not those in government, it's not the oligarchs who are hit by them. We can talk about all that. But it seems these are the sort of at least second best solutions one could think of when one has realized that Article 7 itself, even if it were possible, doesn't really force a country to engage in any sort of immediate change. So hence the proposal is to kind of try to do more on this front. It probably requires treaty change. As you all know, all of us are being held hostage by the UK at the moment as far as the question of treaty change is concerned. But if ever a moment comes where anything is possible at all, then I think one could move towards a new institution in terms of monitoring, but also one that, in a sense, could pull the trigger of sanctions, hopefully highly targeted, smart sanctions, as the cliche goes, and take it from there. And then just hope that that will bring about change by a particular government.
Thank you. Heather, you mentioned a few times the nuclear threat of this. And I just wonder, when I hear this, whether that is in a way similar to the nuclear threat in the Cold War, something which was there, but no one then used it, because and that's similar to Draghi. We will do whatever it takes, and then you don't have to actually do it. Is that the function of Article 7?
Well, the thing is, Draghi had the weapon of a wall of money, whereas the EU, there isn't really a weapon. Sanctions don't work in a club. The EU is ultimately a club, and when every country has a seat at the table, it's very difficult to make sanctions work. That's why, for example, the CVM, the Cooperation and Verification Mechanism that was put in place to make sure that Romania and Bulgaria didn't backslide on their commitments, it never worked, because once they were at the table, they could always plead their case. So you have to think about it much more. Let's look at sociology. We have some very distinguished sociologists in the room. Think about the sociology sociology of these groups, of these kinds of clubs, and how they really function. You're never going to have a sanction of an independent body which can come down hard and really hurt a country, because nobody in the club's going to vote for that kind of sanction. It's just not going to happen. But what you can have are social pressures, and they can be quite severe. Of course, it's also useful to have appeal to the law and to courts and so on. But the social pressure can be quite powerful, and there's some very interesting recent academic work on how social pressure works in the EU from the kind of constructivist strain. I can see a whole CEU research project starting up here. And I would suggest 3 forms of social pressure that could be more effective, because as Jan Wenner was rightly pointing out, isolation doesn't work because you have no exit strategy. That's another problem with Article 7. If you don't know what your exit strategy is, you're very unlikely to start going down that road. That's why it was never used on Austria in 1999 when the Freiheitliche Österreichs was invited to join the government. So no exit strategy, but also isolation. It doesn't cause change. It doesn't do it. So instead of isolating a country, you need to do what the EU normally does with problems. You hug it tight. You draw it into a dialogue, into an engagement that makes it very difficult for that government just to go off and do its own sweet thing. And of course, you can make that quite a public engagement, which then empowers local civil society to play a much bigger role by having, for example, transparent proceedings. I think one of the problems with Reding's latest proposal is that the dialogue between the Commission and the country concerned would happen behind closed doors. It would be all kept secret. No, go and have a public hearing. Mr. Orban, says Viviana. No, Victor, my friend, can you please just explain to me exactly how the media is going to be regulated in this country? And then his public answer is there on public record. You need something public like that, because that is what really empowers civil society and the local press. You also need, I think, in order to do that, much more careful monitoring. That's another part of hug tight. And here I would give a mandate to the Fundamental Rights Agency. A very, very good body set up in Vienna with an extremely limited mandate, because again, the member states don't want to be monitored. So they can't do country monitoring. They can only do monitoring on issues. Now, they've done some very good monitoring, but they need to be given a mandate for some kind of country monitoring where they can actually issue independent reports on what's going on with enough detail, again, enough detail to allow a broader public debate. I think a European public prosecutor, as Andras rightly pointed out, is also helpful in this respect, because again, you can have a formal public proceeding of some kind to talk about infringements. So it's not only the Commission in dialogue with the government in private. I think the EPP idea needs a lot more discussion. It's kind of gone behind closed doors in Brussels. And finally, you can give life to the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Now, I take the point that it's not just all about rights. I mean, okay, I work for Open Society Foundations. I'm going to talk about rights, but the point is the Charter is actually much broader than classical human rights. The Charter covers all kinds of things that deal with different aspects of democracy, and the fact that it's soft law is exactly why its drafters managed to get away with piling in lots and lots of different issues, including quite a few that have to do with democracy. But it's not much discussed in the Union. It's not become public. I think the idea of a European Citizens Initiative on part of the Charter, or on making the Charter real, would be helpful. Again, to make people, and there I think there's a political goal, which is to make people see that a fight between the EU institutions and a government is not about Brussels versus we the people, which is how it's been portrayed in this country and in others, because that's a very easy thing to do. Brussels is coming to criticize us, whereas I know best what my country needs. Very, very easy line to peddle. But instead, what you need is somebody to come along and say, well, to have a public debate within the country about the rights that the EU has given to people by virtue of the Charter and how they should exercise them, and whether the government is actually respecting those rights adequately. So here, the hugging tight is about having a much more detailed debate, because if it's just a political fight between Victor and his counterparts, it's never really going to go anywhere. Especially if it's not Victor versus Viviana. We know who's going to win that public relations battle. No, you need it to be a much more detailed discussion in public, involving civil society, involving the local press. That's the only mechanism that really sanctions a government.
Okay, and as a side note, I just would like to say the Bavarians probably would be very happy that they are discussed here at the European level and as a case study. So just say this to the Bavarians. But coming to Andras, from what I understand, you say we just need a functioning constitutional court and everything would be okay. I mean, that seems to be a pretty straightforward, easy solution in a way. That's a very German solution, so, you know, must work. So maybe you can explain to us why no one came to it before if it's so straightforward?
Yeah, basically the key is the European Charter on Fundamental Rights. There is a key provision, a full library of literature, and that's Article 51 of the Charter. This is about the applicability of EU fundamental rights, and there are different interpretations in the literature, and that's the key issue to understand the problem here. And I disagree with Heather. The Charter is not soft law; it is actually like real law. And the question is in which scope it can be applied. And there are basically 4 opinions. There is a traditional, and in Germany actually, widely held opinion that it can only be applied in extreme cases of breach. Then there is a second opinion also held by the European Court of Justice that it can always be applied when you apply EU law or when you apply EU law which was implemented, and then it has been widened step by step. There was a very famous, very important decision 1 year ago, the Okerberg-Franson decision, which said that also if it's just a collateral application, you have to apply the Charter. That broadened very much the application of the Charter. There's a third opinion promoted by Armin von Bogdandy, the director of the Heidelberg. Yeah.
My hometown.
Yeah, and my boss in Heidelberg. I also work in Heidelberg. Anyway, he promotes the idea of so-called reverse Zoolanger approach. He said that basically the Charter should be applied also, in cases in domestic cases, if you have a systematic violation of fundamental rights. If the fundamental rights protection system fails, then you just grab the Charter. In these extreme cases, there's a 4th proposal